Hi everyone. I'm picking up where I left off with Ramsay Burt and the second part of our reading, where you've been assigned the second part of the book. Although, as you'll notice, we're going to be looking at Trisha Brown's work next, and then Yvonne Rayner's after that. So, if I am giving you a recommendation for what to read in those sections, it's definitely to focus on the material that covers Trisha Brown, which is kind of scattered throughout the remaining chapters in Burt. So I'm going to give you a quick, broad overview of what I think is interesting about the Burt, and then we'll get more specific about Trisha Brown's practice in preparing you to look at some of the material next week. As you'll notice, Burt rather is really positioning dance in relationship to the visual arts, and he does so specifically in chapters 3 and 4 through a relationship to minimalism and a relationship to pop art. I'm actually going to start by talking about pop art because it's more exceptional in the kind of history that we often get about the Judson Dance Theater, and it's also because there are fewer examples of the kind of ways that pop art influences this kind of coterie of dancers. So Burt talks about how a handful of dancers are actually less interested in sort of refusing the long history of narrative in dance. Dance is based on certain kinds of stories, and in fact reappropriating the tools of representation that are allowed by dance. I think one of the interesting things about this field, and this will come up explicitly in the Yvonne Rayner readings we look at, is that when you have a live body on stage, how can you do anything other than be representational would be one kind of challenge to pose. You have the body right there in front of you, so certainly you can't create necessarily the kind of abstract expressionist work of someone like Mark Rothko, right, which is just a color field. So that would be one argument. I'm sure you could certainly contest that, but it's the idea that the live body and the presence of a body in general brings up representation. So with the pop artists, Burt's talking about how a number of them are actually interested in this kind of reference to everyday life, to the lives of individuals, and that many of the dancers are interested in reappropriating the tools of representation in order to incorporate specifically personal or subcultural experiences and aesthetics into their work. Burt links this resurgence of a kind of interest in sort of foregrounding the presence of the dancer to a kind of allegorical mode, and this is pretty traditional for readings of postmodernism. Critics like Rosalind Krauss and Craig Owens have often described postmodernism as a sort of allegorical process, one in which aspects of the personal aren't simply reproduced on stage, but are actually sort of transformed or transfigured into other aspects. That being the way that allegory is a kind of small section that stands for something larger. It's the idea that somehow these small components of a work might actually stand for or stand in for or gesture towards certain aspects of the personal or subcultural experiences that these artists are trying to incorporate. So it's not that you actually have artists like Fred Herko coming on stage and performing his own life on stage, but that in something like his eccentric use of costuming, the multiplicity of people doing all sorts of different actions on stage, while Fred is perhaps wearing a lampshade on his head and circling the stage wearing one roller skate, which actually happens in one of his performances, perhaps some of those gestures point to aspects of his life working in the underground cinema, working with Andy Warhol, leading a queer existence in New York City during the 50s and 60s, that in some ways the sort of excess and kind of exuberance of Herko's performances retain a certain element of his own personality in them, we might say. So that's one way to look at it. Another artist we might look at is someone like Carolee Schneemann, and particularly her performance Meat Joy, which I think we covered last semester, but if not, it's on YouTube and you can look at it. But essentially, for this performance, Schneemann has a handful of performers wearing bikinis come on stage, and meat is thrown onto them, and they roll around with all sorts of meat that you would buy at the grocery store, like, steaks and pieces of chicken and stuff. It's important that it's not just it's not raw meat from a kind of like surrealist perspective of being interested in the butcher, but in fact, Carolee Schneeman's going to the grocery store, pulling the meat that you can get there, putting it on tops of male and female bodies and watching them roll around. So in some ways, it's this whole meditation on desire, questions about gender roles, about reproduction, and about the way that bodies are kind of seen as meat, especially the female body is kind of figured as a sort of meat in certain ways. And so Schneeman might be thought of in relationship to pop art as well in that regard. And certainly that's not to draw lines or distinctions to say that Schneeman and Herco couldn't also be thought of as minimalists. Although with Herco, it's a really interesting example of someone whose performative work was super eccentric. And because it didn't conform to the kinds of legible minimalism of the times, work like Trisha Brown and Yvonne Rainer, that was really sparse in some ways, there is actually a profound lack of an archive around Herco's work. There's no videos of his performances. There's a few documents of when he performed, but for the most part, we rely on stories from people who were actually there. And this brings up just an interesting aside for us about how talking about dance or embodied practices as an art form always brings up the question of documentation. And this will come up in the readings we do about Yvonne Rainer, but it's a real question of what kind of materials remain. Because with a painting, you have the painting to persist through time, often, not always. But with dance, you don't have that. And especially with performance art as well, you don't have that. So what does signify the practice? What does remain for us is a big question we could ask. But going back to Burt's readings, so we've covered a little bit of the pop art references. Of course, minimalism stands out as the predominant artistic field that is in relationship to the Judson Dance Theater. This is a different lineage of minimalism than we got last semester when we talk about minimalism in the visual arts. Here, especially because the live body is in play, we have to reconfigure this term a little bit and think about what it means here, because it doesn't always mean the same sort of thing. If you try to start to think minimalism means the same thing for dance and the visual arts, you'll get very confused. Same thing if you think modernism means the same thing for dance and the visual arts. Very confused. Even if there are overlapping components, it's not all the same. So we can think of minimalism, for instance, in the visual arts in relationship to Robert Morris's work, right? Some of his structures in which you have essentially a cube and we're contemplating the cube itself. But then we also have Robert Morris's performance works like Sight, where, actually, before I talk about Sight, I can mention another one of Robert Morris's performances where he topples the monument of modernism by literally, it's a performance at 7 minutes long, 3.5 minutes. You're looking at a tall monument, like a monolith on stage. It's a large white rectangle. And then he pulls it down, it topples and breaks, and then you see the toppled monument for 3.5 minutes. And that's very much a reference to the toppling of modernism, to its kind of uniformity, to its kind of grandeur, and bringing it down to this kind of interest of the minimalists, right? But then Robert Morris also does performances with bodies on stage, and one of them is called Sight, in which Carolee Schneeman actually poses in a tableau reminiscent of Manet's Olympia. And Robert Morris manipulates these large white boards. And again, you have the references of minimalism in visual art. You have the whiteness, the stark whiteness, the kind of flatness as Morris manipulates these kinds of standard building materials. And then you also have this component of minimalism in performance, where you have Carolee Schneeman who sits in a pose and holds that pose the entire time. Now, there's a lot of problems we could bring up with this kind of reference, or the way that there's this naked female body on stage and she's doing absolutely nothing, and all the kind of feminist critiques that have been done of that. But it's interesting to see in that performance, which you can also find on YouTube, very much how the language of minimalism in the visual arts and the language of minimalism in dance are coming into relationship right there. We see this perhaps most concretely, and most dancers you talk to who will, when you ask them who was the most influential dancer of the Judson kind of era, they'll say Trisha Brown. Trisha Brown, even though Yvonne Rainer gets a lot of traction for being the most well-known, Trisha Brown is cited as kind of like the founding dancer's dancer back in the day, minimalist artist, kind of breaking the mold of what we think of as dance. And a lot of this comes through Brown's own critique of what Burt describes as the problem of performance. The problem of performance being the sense that all performance is somehow artificial, that it's a sort of projection of presence on stage, right? So we can think about that in terms of theater, for instance, that an actor goes out on stage and is present as the actor, but is supposedly projecting a presence that is not him or herself, right? So if I'm Hamlet, I'm supposed to be Hamlet on stage, not Josh. But yet Josh is on stage, my body is on stage, so then how do I kind of obscure that by projecting some sort of artificial presence, by lying to the audience, right? On top of that, there's the problem, so Brown and others are interested in getting towards the more authentic self on stage, right? That how can we have a performance in which I am not performing some version of someone else, or even performing some version of myself, but doing something authentic on stage becomes a real concern. There's also a real concern over questions about the spectacle and what it means for certain bodies to be on display for other bodies. This will come up very much in the Yvonne Rainer reading we do for next week, so I'm going to kind of put a pin in that and save it for next, or 2 weeks from now. But so with Brown, we have these questions of like the spectacle of the body. We have questions about getting towards authenticity. And it becomes for Brown about a way of getting to dance underneath any sort of training that might persist. If we think of trained dancers or trained ballet dancers as somehow being written on and their bodies being inscribed and inscribed and inscribed with a certain way of practicing, with certain values and techniques, Trisha Brown wants to get to something much more somatic and anatomical. That is, to explore what the body is capable of outside of what the body is being told to do. And so for Brown, she uses a lot of found movement, sitting, walking, lying down. You'll see a lot of these examples in her work, in the video that we see. And you'll see a lot as well of task-based performances, which is a mode of performing in which dancers are given a task rather than a narrative structure or a certain set of kind of movements or kind of prescribed movements. That the task in some way allows you, a task such as walking, allows it to remain open to the interpretation given by different bodies, that different bodies will walk differently. And also allows Brown as a choreographer to get around ways of structuring everyday movement into sort of narratives of saying, what are you walking from or towards? How do you get to just pure walking? Instead of saying walking is from one place to another, we could say that the task of walking is one in which you're confronted with the challenge of doing something so simple on stage, right? This sort of mode of task-based performances, of using task-based movement, of using found movement, of exploring the body's somatic and anatomical capacities, is all part of Brown's kind of resistance to the prevailing conventions of choreography, especially during the 1960s. It's not about expression. It's not about narrative. It's not about plot. It's not about telling a story or even about some sort of intentional abstraction. It's trying to get to the most simple elements of a body moving in space, right? And how to get to that body moving in space, not only in the body's own kind of improvisatory or kind of singular presence, but in the relationship that choreography establishes. How does she as a choreographer get around the authority she's imbued with to tell bodies what to do, right? So she has to get past these questions of making subjective choices in the context of dance. and even with the audience, to get them around the idea that dance would somehow tell them a story or be structured around some sort of arc or some sort of beginning, middle, and end, to convince herself, her dancers, and the audience, as she'll say, that the performance is what it is, which is, of course, what Robert Morris says about his artworks. It is what it is. So in a way, that's the way that the minimalism component carries over between visual arts and dance. It's about saying, looking at this thing in front of you is so much harder than you imagine. And that the idea of getting to it being just what it is a much harder task. And what it reveals is all the layers in which we've been conditioned to experience our bodies, our movements, to experience the field of dance in certain ways. That there are all these voices of authority kind of hemming us in and keeping us from getting towards that kind of authentic quality, right? So we see this in the sort of choreographic constructs that Brown provides. And I say constructs because it's always this kind of confluence of elements, such as her performance, Man Walking Down the Side of a Building, which is a performance that happens in the 70s, where a man in a harness literally walks down the side of a building, and that's the choreography. But it's really interesting to think about how gravity is at play in an extreme way in that regard. The building becomes a kind of performer or co-performer because it's precisely the edifice of the building that allows the walking to occur. Walking down the side of a building is not something a body can do without assistance from other elements, but walking is something a body can do. So how do we understand this sort of mode of walking? And how does it undermine the idea that dance or choreography is somehow this like monumental act of creativity? That instead what Brown has done is set up the conditions for a certain movement to occur. Another performance where we see Brown's hand kind of more forcefully in its formal qualities is in the rooftop performance piece, where you have a series of dancers spread out across various rooftops in Soho, and one dancer begins an action, and the next dancer kind of follows in sort of a game of telephone, but where they all actually know the performance in advance. And what it does is, as an audience member, you can be positioned to see any number of these performers, but you can't see all of them at once. Because they are spread out in a certain distance, the dance itself gets spread out over space, and so you can never fully grasp the entire event itself, right? So she's breaking open the model that dance is somehow this enclosed event that you sit and watch in the theater. Other things to notice in Trisha Brown's work as you kind of view the videos would be her use of repetition. Repetition is a really important component of dance and embodied practices, especially in the way it kind of undermines meaning, that a certain gesture doesn't just become meaningful, but as you do it over and over again, it actually starts to lose its meaning and the formal qualities appear. You can see this in the way that you even, like, if you repeat a word over and over again, it starts to lose its meaning. Another version of repetition is the way that it sort of reveals a structure or reveals a way of thinking about that which is repeated, and to think of it as a kind of system. So, for instance, you can see like in accumulation with talking plus water motor. If you watch, there's a video of Brown doing this on YouTube, and I believe it's in the video that I sent you, but if not, you can look it up on YouTube. Accumulation is one performance, talking is another performance, and water motor is another performance. And Brown combines these three aspects, layering them one on top of the other to show the complexities of merging these systems. So it's not just that like one gesture needs to be repeated over and over, but in fact the gesture is a kind of system that when I try to do this on top of it, it gets even more complicated. That's a very simple example with my hands, but you can see actually a beautiful example of how talking becomes harder the more that accumulation takes over Brown's body. And it's just a really interesting way of thinking about how these dances aren't just a series of movements one after another, but are actually a kind of system that when you interrupt its logic by interjecting another system, it becomes really difficult to maintain their integrity. And overall, if you're to take one thing away from the Trisha Brown readings and the Trisha Brown videos, it's the idea of how do we let go of the old ways of structuring movement material. And how do we move towards a system of improvisation and of shifting the context in which dance occurs? We're starting to explore dance as a kind of expanded field, right? It's not just limited by the proscenium stage, it's not just limited to telling a certain story, but it's about trying to locate dance in a variety of sites. And I think Brown's work is it's really influential for a number of dancers precisely because of the way she strips dance of all of its conventions and of all of its crutches, trying to just get down to the basic ways that bodies move and the ways in which you can also consider structuring that movement without resorting to the kind of old systems of having a single authorial voice. So that's where I'll leave you with Trisha Brown. We'll pick up next week with Yvonne Rayner, who is also really fascinating, very similar, and also has some quite interesting differences from Trisha Brown's work.